From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Madison, at the beginning of the convention, versus Madison we read about in the Federalist papers, make very different arguments, but it's the same statesman and it's the same principles driving it. But he's learned. He's learned as he goes along, and he loses, and then, of course, by losing, he ultimately wins.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Matthew Spalding, Vice President of Washington Operations and Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C. With Independence Day just around the corner, and also the anniversary of James Madison's death upon us, he died June 28, 1836, we take time today to talk about James Madison pre-presidency, specifically around the founding of our country. Dr. Spalding, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And we talk today from the Boyle Studio inside the Kirby Center at Hillsdale in D.C. I realized recently we've done this show for 5 years or so now, and I don't think we have had a specific segment discussing the great James Madison. We're changing that today. More early James Madison discussion today, pre-presidency. Tell us early a bit about Madison's background and how does he enter the world of politics?
So, when I heard this, of course, I immediately jumped at the opportunity because James Madison is a fascinating figure, and I'm especially interested in James Madison before he becomes James Madison. That is before he's president. That period of the American Revolution, Articles of Confederation into the Convention, the Federalist Papers. Partially because there's this amazing and really beautiful transformation that occurs because we forget sometimes that a lot of what Madison did, they were learning on the fly. Mm-hmm. They're in the middle of all this, and it's a fabulous story. So he's born in Virginia, and he ends up going to the College of New Jersey, which of course we've never heard of, because his letter changed to Princeton. And I always thought it's a great, an ironic but very interesting thing that two of the most important presidents are minds in American politics who kind of reshape how we think about politics and then become president. Go to Princeton. One's James Madison. The other, of course, is Woodrow Wilson, the great progressive thinker. And that juxtaposition is fascinating. Madison goes to the school, studies with Witherspoon, and at one point is thinking about going into the seminaries, actually stays an extra year to study theology. But his real interest is in politics, and he wants to get involved in politics. But he's very much kind of I hate to use the word kind of dweeby, but he's kind of an intellectual. He's not a man of action. Mm-hmm. He's a man of thought. He's a legislator by definition. He thinks in those terms. But the moment and the timing of it is crucial because the most important thing that happens to him, the most important relationship that comes into it for both parties involved is James Madison becomes a legislator. He's at the Confederation Congress, and he becomes the ally of George Washington. And he's on the War Committee. And that whole relationship is really the birth of everything to follow.
As a member of Congress, he's witnessing firsthand some of the problems the government is having under the Articles of Confederation. So why does he think that a national convention could help to solve these problems?
Well, part of it is, and yet we have to, when we recall how all this comes into play, we have the Declaration of Independence in 1776 that call for a constitution. That eventually becomes the Articles of Confederation, which is technically our first constitution, but that does not come into play until 1781, later in the war. Most of the time during the war, the government is essentially ran by the the Confederation Congress, someone like Madison and Washington, who's the de facto head of state. But they have you get the Articles. The Articles are largely turn out to be unworkable because they're still trying to figure this out. The Articles are very much emphasize the role of the states, which is not necessarily a problem. The larger problem is how they operated. It took a supermajority to get anything done. Any fundamental changes had to be unanimous. which meant individual states had vetoes, and it just doesn't really work. And one of the things they can't do is figure out how to raise money, the taxing power. Now, I'm generally opposed to taxes, but you do need taxes to operate in the just doing the practical things, i.e., paying the army,
right,
and fighting the war, which becomes a big problem towards the end of the American Revolution. And so they're trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And so Madison is introducing an impost. He's doing all these things, trying to figure out. These all fail. And he, at a certain point, realizes we need to have another cut at the apple.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, the war is coming to a close. Only way to do it is this idea, which they've used in terms of other things during the Revolution, this idea of a convention. And so they actually have this idea. Indeed, towards the end, Madison suggests this idea to Hamilton. They talk about it, and they both are like, it'll never work. Hamilton goes back to New York to his law practice. Madison puts his notes in his books and is doing committee works in Congress. It has to play out from there. You have the Annapolis Convention, preceded actually by the Mount Vernon Convention, which is a meeting at Washington's Mount Vernon. The Annapolis Convention then proposes, and eventually we have the Philadelphia Convention. And Madison is, of course, a key player in that convention, among other things, in Congress proposing the convention occur. And then he goes back, and then he becomes once again a Virginia legislature in Virginia, proposing the Virginia delegation to go to the convention he had previously proposed as a congressman, to be headed by Washington, of course, but to also include James Madison.
Talking with Dr. Matthew Spalding about James Madison here, the early part of his life. So you have different ideas of what should happen at this convention and how something new can be constructed. There is the Virginia plan from the state of James Madison. How much of that Virginia plan flowed from the mind of Madison?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it, if the overwhelming sense, if not he drafts it, and you could actually see it in some of his earlier letters, especially between Washington and Madison. Once Washington says, okay, we're going to have the convention and I'm going to go, which meant it was going to work because Washington is the figure.
Mm-hmm.
He sends Madison a letter, who's been out at Orange, which is just kind of west of the Washington, D.C. area, if you're thinking about it in terms of geographic terms. And it turns out Madison had been thinking about this at great length. And so he responds with this very long letter, essentially laying out what becomes the Virginia plan. The Virginia delegation, headed by Washington with Madison and Governor Randolph, go to the convention early and meet and are there a few weeks. And lo and behold, Washington becomes the head of the convention, and the Virginia plan is introduced by the governor of Virginia. It's been drafted, essentially put together by James Madison, who's going to take extensive notes. So the plan is from the get-go to kind of run the convention and push it towards these ideas, which is a very popular government based on the idea of consent coming out of the Declaration, a stronger national government, although it's not fundamentally different from the Articles, but it has certain powers are clarified. It changes the nature of representation in a very important way in the original proposal. And originally, it was actually much stronger than actually what came out of the convention in the end, which itself is another great story, which is to say that Madison actually lost many of his arguments at the convention. Some of the things he thought were crucial at the beginning of the convention, proposed in the Virginia plan, don't survive till the end. And that actually is the great story about it, because Madison at the beginning of the convention versus Madison we read about in the Federalist Papers make very different arguments, but it's the same statesman and it's the same principles driving it. But he's learned. He's learned as he goes along, and he loses, and then of course by losing he ultimately wins.
Very quickly, perhaps, what are some of those arguments that Madison has at the beginning that he then...
So, for instance, one of the key things that he proposes in his letter to Washington, is in the original Virginia plan, is that he thinks the national government needs a veto over the states. So if they do something the national government doesn't like, they would actually get rid of that. Let's say, well, come on. As a practical matter, that's going nowhere when you have state delegations at the convention. Madison is vehemently opposed to what is called the Great Compromise between the Senate and the House. He opposed that to the bitter end. And you can imagine at one point Washington pulls him aside and says, Jimmy, as they called him, you got to get on board here. But the point is, he does.
Mm-hmm.
And he learns what's going on. And after that great compromise is made, everything changes, and they start redesigning how the president's going to work, the Senate versus the House, right? And so a lot of the arguments we see them, the great champion of in the Federalist Papers, separation of powers, the relationship between the branches, who has what powers and how it works. A lot of that becomes clear once he actually loses some key things at the convention, and he realizes, and he starts seeing a different way of putting it together. And you can actually see, if you read the notes of the convention and see them, this is what in my class, we read these very, very closely. You actually see his mind working. And it's actually a beautiful thing. You see his mind working, and you see how he gets there. That's the great statesmanship of James Madison.
We'll continue our conversation in just a moment with Dr. Matthew Spalding about James Madison. First, I want to ask you, think about, act, join the Liberty and Learning Society at Hillsdale College. All of our podcasts here on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network are listener-supported. We count on, we rely on the support of listeners like you to make our educational outreach possible. The Liberty and Learning Society, well, that's our exclusive monthly giving group. All you have to do is go to hillsdale.edu/monthly and complete the secure online donation form. Most people give about $25 a month, but if you have to pause or stop your gift at some point, you can simply call. One of our friendly students or staff will help you out. I hope you will consider joining our monthly giving club today, the Liberty and Learning Society. You can do it by going to hillsdale.edu/monthly. That's hillsdale.edu/monthly to join the Liberty and Learning Society and help support the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour and the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. hillsdale.edu/monthly. We continue now with Dr. Matthew Spalding from Hillsdale in D.C. as we discuss James Madison, specifically that time pre-presidency around the founding of our country. Dr. Spalding. When we look at the great tenets of our government, separation of powers, checks and balances, the idea of federalism, are all of those contributions or ideas that end up being championed by Madison?
Well, for sure, they all end up being championed by Madison. And for sure, all of them in one way or other are thought of by Madison. But it comes back to this point about at what point does it come into being? Take the question of federalism, for instance. Federalism, which we understand is really the heart, in many ways, the operational heart of how the American system is set up. We have a layer of state constitutional governments and the federal government. And that relationship between them really is another version of the separation of powers, as opposed to the one within government between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. The federal state one is another version. As I mentioned earlier, Madison, didn't like the Senate setup where the states are actually in the Senate. He didn't want the states to have a key role because they thought the states were a problem, which they were at the time of the Articles of Confederation. Mm-hmm. They were violating rights. There was no property rights. They were raising taxes willy-nilly. He didn't want to go there, but he realized he had to go there. And so the concept of federalism is essentially invented on the fly. And what we see explained later in the Federalist Papers, and Madison writes some of the key papers on federalism, partly national, partly federal, right? That's what he learns. And he sees a virtue in what is practically necessary. That itself is a great manifestation of what we call the virtue of prudence. Mm-hmm. Right? It's driven by the same principle. Right. This must be a regime driven by consent and constitutional government. But an accommodation, a practical prudential accommodation, is something like federalism, which is good structurally, and you figured out why structurally it was a good, but it still serves the ultimate objective. Mm-hmm. His principle. He doesn't change on principle.
Talking with Dr. Matthew Spalding, Vice President of Washington Operations, Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Hillsdale in D.C., on James Madison. You allude to this earlier. We have Madison's notes from the convention. The debates were secret, so what we know, a lot comes from these notes of Madison. You read them in your class. It's a valuable record of what happened. So what did we eventually learn from these papers? What's the story that's told from Madison's hand?
Well, I think what's the overarching one that's told is he lost, which is to say that he came in playing a very strong hand in the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan actually then It survives overall. It's not a complete loss, but it becomes something different with the Great Compromise. And Madison has to play some cleanup to get to where it ultimately comes out. But in the Federalist Papers, he's figured out how this is actually, it turns into a virtue. And he realizes how the pieces work together in a way that creates this dynamic sense of a federal constitutional government, and he becomes the greatest advocate of it. Mm-hmm. And so it's this great story of learning, and he learns how to go there. One other thing I will mention very quickly that we learn in his notes, which was not understood until they come out, and they don't come out until after his death. And I think they actually are out in early 1830s, which of course is the beginning of the antebellum period, and slavery is the issue. His notes reveal a very serious debate about slavery at the convention, and they reveal that the compromise of the convention about slavery on the slave trade, which is a postponement of abolishing it, 3/5 clause, which was introduced by an abolitionist, and the Fugitive Slave Clause, which is a terribly written clause meant to not give power to getting back fugitive slaves. It reveals all that, and it also reveals very famously, very importantly, that Madison was one of the people that said the word person should always be used, not the word property, because we cannot give anyone the idea that there ever is a legitimate idea that there should be property in men. That phrase becomes the key phrase for the abolitionist movement.
Now we have a document. We worry about ratification. The Federalist Papers, more of Madison's writings. He wrote 29 of the 85 essays in the Federalist Papers, and two of the most famous, numbers 10 and 51. So Federalist 10, Federalist 51. What are the core ideas inside those two Federalist Papers?
First, just make a quick point, because this plays right along in terms of how we get to Madison's role here. So the Federalist Papers is meant to support ratification. That's you really have to do a complete separate conversation about the Federalist Papers sometime, because Hamilton's role in that and the whole story of the Federalist Papers is fascinating. So Hamilton is up in New York, and he wants to get all these papers because he's worried about ratification in New York. And he eventually pulls in this buddy he's met at the Constitutional Convention from Virginia named James Madison. Madison goes up to New York, and they're writing feverishly to get all these out. It's just an amazing thing. And at certain points, they're writing them so fast, and the printer is literally taking them while the ink is wet to try to get them printed for the newspapers. So it's an amazing political and human accomplishment. But Madison is responsible for a number of very important ones, 10 and 51 being the most famous. I'm not sure they are necessarily the most important. I think sometimes Federalist 10 is overemphasized because of historically we've emphasized it. Mm-hmm. But what happens in those, and what his major intellectual contribution to American political science, for that matter, is one of the things you see it in the notes of the convention. You see him his thinking. It's not a new argument, but you're seeing it develop as it goes right before your eyes. Is this notion that man has interests. Human nature has interests. It's in the very nature of man. But there's also an upside to man as well, which is they're also capable of thinking about high, important political principles. But we must design government to take both of those into account. We can't assume that man is all good and will just do things because we have parchment barriers and that. And we shouldn't assume that they're all bad, meaning that they're kind of Hobbesian, low political actors. Instead, it's the mix. And how do we design a constitution to do that? And really, that's what Madison's kind of brilliant descriptions in 10 and 51 lend themselves to, which is we want more opinions, a diversity in the faculty of men. We want to protect and preserve those. So we're going to expand the sphere, which is kind of the argument of Federalist 10, this notion of faction. This will break faction, which is a bad thing, which think of today as more as kind of narrow self-interest dominating government. We want less of that. But instead, his great argument is we want to use the natural ambition in man to connect the ambition of the individual to the responsibilities of the place or the office, if you will. So the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. We're going to make them fight with each other and compete. But by competing, they're going to all focus their attentions on preserving their power. And preserving their power means their constitutional power, which means upholding the rule of law. Mm-hmm. And so the separation of powers theory comes into being. It's never stated directly in the Constitution, but in its workings, when you read the Federalist Papers, you see what it is, which is the presidential veto of the legislature. The legislature can override the veto. I think we're all familiar with the checks and balances.
Yeah.
Listen to Schoolhouse Rock. But he explains that, and it becomes an actual idea in of itself, and you see it. And really, his brilliance was to figure all that out. In the midst of having lost some of these key votes at the convention, he thought the only way to do it was to actually have an absolute veto over the states, or the government has to be completely popular. And he realizes that, well, no, we can make them work against each other and turn these things into a virtue. And so, for instance, the Senate, which is the home of state representation, or at least until the amendment, but even still, some extent, it's still the case today. We're going to actually make them. They compete with the House on certain things. We divide their powers, and that's part of the solution as well. So all of that is beautifully explained in 10 and 51. 51 really gets into a full expression of what the American argument, the separation of powers, is, and how it's grounded this idea of human nature, but also serves a higher purpose. He says there, justice is the end of government, and it will be pursued until it's achieved. But you must structure government in a way that actually serves justice, and that's what that design is meant to do.
One final question for Dr. Matthew Spalding on James Madison, this portion of Madison's public life. Another example, perhaps, of Madison losing yet winning. He at first opposes a Bill of Rights for the Constitution, but he changes his mind. What convinces him to change his mind there?
Well, that's another great story. You can do a whole session on that, and this is a wonderful example of Madison's mind as well. The Constitutional Convention considers the idea of adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and overwhelmingly vote it down. George Mason and others, famously don't sign the Constitution because that's one of the problems they see in it. And at several of the ratification conventions, they will only ratify it if there's a Bill of Rights added. Well, Madison's argument, and you see this in the Federalist Papers because it argues against the Bill of Rights in the Federalist Papers. I think they're right in principle, which was, if you have a government of limited powers, there's no need for a Bill of Rights. All it's going to do is cause problems, and it's going to cause interpretive problems with the Supreme Court. And of course, they're absolutely right about that. But Madison, this is a great example of prudence, right? Well, in order to get the Constitution ratified, which is the objective here, we need to add a Bill of Rights. And so what does Madison do? It's not merely that he decides to support a Bill of Rights. I will support a Bill of Rights, but I'll write the Bill of Rights. And so he carefully writes them, right? And he's head of the committee. He brings in all the suggestions. He puts together the language, and he plays a key role in that. But that's why the Bill of Rights is actually carefully written about Congress shall have no power. And you have the 9th and 10th Amendment, which solves the interpretive problem. And you have the 10th Amendment, which talks about the importance of states. And you have the First Amendment, which then, of course, puts the fundamental principles together to start off with. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association. That's Madison's doing. So he didn't flip. He didn't change his mind. He didn't, like as we do, politicians now do today.
Right.
He followed the same principle, which is it's about the Constitution and the rule of law and consent and representation and the proper way of having that work. And if we need a Bill of Rights for prudential reasons, we'll have a Bill of Rights, and I will write it in a way that is consistent with the objective. And that's what he did.
Dr. Matthew Spalding, Vice President of Washington Operations, Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C. We talk from the Boyle Studio at the Kirby Center at Hillsdale in D.C. on James Madison. Come back for a part 2. Dr. Matthew Spalding, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
As always, great to be with you.
Up next, we talk with Joy Pullmann, executive editor at the Federalist. Her new book is False Flag: Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free, and I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That's at podcast.hillsdale.edu. You'll find older episodes of this program, plus other great Hillsdale College audio like The Larry Arnn Show, Imprimis, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, and, relatively new, Hillsdale College online courses at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Joy Pullmann. She is executive editor at The Federalist, also a Hillsdale alum, also the author of a new book, False Flag: Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. Joy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
You say at the beginning of False Flag that Western society is being erased by the purposeful destabilization of the institution that creates society, which is the natural family. So why is there so much animosity and so much effort put into the destruction of the natural family?
The main reason for that is because the family is a bulwark against big totalitarian government. Families basically can be self-sustaining. Obviously, I do think families need communities. They need to work into concert. But, there's many things that families provide that if they do it well, if they do their jobs well, then there isn't a need for a big government. If families take care of their own, we don't need welfare state. We don't need just so many organs of bureaucracy. And so the family competes with big government basically for autonomy, for control of itself, for self-direction, for the control of society. And so therefore, anyone who wants to have a big government micromanage other people's affairs, the family is a natural enemy.
The false flag you refer to in the title is the pride flag, the one we see so much during this month that we are talking and having this conversation. You say in the name of love, the pride flag stokes hatred. How does a flag do that?
Well, it's a very cheerful flag with lots of colors that are multiplying, but behind it, it really stands for a movement that, I'm pausing here because I have small children, so I'm just going to warn parents that I'm saying something maybe you don't want little children to hear. And I don't get too graphic, but wouldn't like my 6-year-old to hear this. In the name of love, they're stripping young teenagers' forearms of all of their skin to use it to construct fake genitals for that child. Right? They're going and stripping into their abdomen, and pulling out pieces of skin to create other fake genitals. They're cutting off children's chests, double mastectomies for 13, 14-year-old girls. That is not love. That is war against human nature. That is hatred. That's the brutality. And that's what that flag stands for, and that's what it accomplishes wherever it goes. And so anyone who believes that it is loving to do that needs to have his head checked.
Joy Pullmann with us, her new book, False Flag: Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. The Supreme Court case, the Bostock case, which you refer to, you call it the next Roe v. Wade. Tell people what the Bostock case is and why there is some consternation about that ruling and why it might change in the future.
So that was the case in which two Republican-appointed justices, Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch, joined the court's Constitution haters to create a decision that rewrites federal law from the bench, something that Constitution-loving justices are not supposed to be doing. And the reason for that is because our founders would have called that an act of tyranny. That's not the job of the judiciary. That's the job of the legislature to write laws. The people need to have a voice in those laws. And these arguments I'm saying here were written in the dissents, written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Alito, which was joined by Clarence Thomas. But what that law basically did was provide the pretext for the Biden administration to transgender everything. And so we've seen over the Biden administration, they cite that law when they issue regulations from every single possible federal agency with effects on every single area of American life, because the federal government is so big. They are saying that they're pushing rules that you can't be a foster parent. You're a child abuser as a foster parent if you do not want to mutilate children. Once that's written into law, it will affect all the rest of us parents, right? Because if it's child abuse for foster parents, it's also child abuse for any other parent to do that sort of thing. The Biden administration has, in its agriculture policy, which is largely food welfare, said, you can't accept food stamps or the school lunch program if you're not going to, force your employees to use all the pronouns, compel their speech, put the kids in the wrong bathrooms, have them shower together naked, et cetera, et cetera. So that decision, Justice Alito did say in his dissent that because of it, the judiciary will be mired, and dealing with all of these separate controversies that it justifies for years and years. And he's been absolutely right about that. It's been a disaster. And seeing as I do that, the whole transgender issue basically is the next Roe versus Wade. It is, the next desecration of the human body in the name of a distorted political ideology, a atheist political cult at its core, which I talk about in the book. This decision really is the next Roe versus Wade, because it's the next frontier in the destruction of the natural rights of Americans to be secure in their lives and their livelihoods.
In Chapter 4, you say that queer Americans are trading in the American birthright of equal rights for special rights granted by the government. And it's dangerous, and they should perhaps look at it as dangerous, because if they are not rights granted by God, it's not natural law, natural rights. Those are rights that can be stripped from you or anyone at any moment.
That's right. So I talk about how, this is really a bait and switch for homosexuals, for transgender people. A lot of Americans are comfortable with the notion of, look, in your private life, there's a lot of freedom perhaps available to you as long as you're not infringing on my rights, as long as you're not showing your naked body parts to my children. I think that most Americans probably agree with some version of that sentiment. But the problem, queer people are being told that, it's somehow good for them if they sign on to the cultural Marxist program, which amounts to the erasure of their equal individual natural rights to government. But one problem with that is that, the erasure of American limited government basically is the invitation for totalitarianism, because once you have unlimited government, that is the definition of totalitarianism and tyranny. Under the guise of, for example, hate speech, even queer people are being denied their free speech. And I believe that all people, Americans, no matter, what they do in their bedrooms at night, they should have equal rights to all of their natural rights as secured under the Constitution, and not have them erased by these fake rights, these, fake hate speech rights, and these fake identity politics laws, and so on and so forth. All the other things that come with the so-called Pride program. So basically, these politics really not only exploit all of Americans, and that includes queer people. And I think some of them do stand up and recognize that, but their voices really are not allowed to be heard. They're censored and shut down, which is yet another reason I think they should join with the rest of us in opposing these and seeking to restore individual natural rights that are equal for every American, no matter what they do in a home and private.
Also in that same chapter, Joy, you write about the backlash against queer aggression, queer saturation, recent polling showing a drop in approval of same-sex relationships. I saw another one this morning, in fact, that, trending down a few points here, a few points there. Mm-hmm. What is society, at least some portions of society, saying about what they're seeing and how it's reflected in their acceptance of others?
Well, we were told that, a de-sexing marriage and erasing marriage would allow, people to visit each other in their hospital rooms, when they had a loved one who was dying. We were not told that it would involve, publicly sponsored pornography in every library in public school in America. So some Americans are still okay with the one and absolutely uncomfortable as they should be with the other. So there's been totally a bait and switch that occurred here, which, is common with the left. They're deceivers. They lie to people in order to get their foot in the door. And then once they're in, they do a bunch of other things that people didn't expect. And that's absolutely what's happened with the Pride program.
You write later on, you talked about parents previously, and there's a subhead in chapter 6 that says, "Don't tell your parents," is what predators say. I make this point often in conversations and interviews. We have been telling our children, and parents told me and told you, if someone tells you don't tell anyone, that's the secret you have to tell. Someone is trying to do something bad. It is a bad situation, and yet it seems that by and large, policies these days are enforcing that exact mantra, which is don't tell your parents. Don't tell your parents. We won't tell them. You don't tell them.
Yes, so I write about in the book, for example, what California and number of other completely run states are doing in that regard. Kids can go to their public school and be transported from there to a publicly funded so-called health, clinic where the children are receiving self-mutilating treatments as young as age 13 or 14 without their parents' knowledge. Again, the founders would have considered that probably a call to arms, honestly, but that is completely untenable and unacceptable under, a constitutional framework. Parents are the natural protectors of children. They are the natural mentors and guides. They are the people who, statistically speaking, are the most motivated to love and protect children more than any other single person on the planet. And so instead of being shut out of their children's lives, parents obviously should be respected, and invited into everything involved with their children because they're adults who have most likely than any other institution, their children's best interests at heart. And so again, like you said, anyone who says, don't tell your mom or dad, that person should be immediately suspect number one, and probably shut out of your family circle. And everyone knows that.
The chapter on the military, probably want to ask about this two ways, but you begin by laying out these military officers that now are admitting to lying to elected officials about policy and personnel because of sexual politics. What kind of things are they lying about, and why would they lie about it?
Well, Representative Jim Banks, who is from Indiana, he's running for a U.S. Senate seat currently. He says that Navy officials lied to him. I believe he sits on the Armed Forces Committee in the House. And he says that, once basically the story broke, I think it was Libs of TikTok, the account on Twitter, and that does a lot of these things, broke the fact that the U.S. military was using a transgender serviceman as one of its promotional materials to try to recruit people. And so that created a big hubbub. And then Representative Banks says that the military lied to him that they didn't even have that program. Turns out there are receipts. He was paid. They call it a pilot program. Seems suspicious. You know how it is with these sorts of investigations. They take a lot of time and there's a lot of stonewalling. But but that's not the only thing. I talk about in the book how for example, the entire invitation of queer people to the military, the embedding it was military policy for years and years and years to discharge people who identified as homosexual. It's because, people of the same sex are in close quarters. People should be focusing on business while they're part in the military. Pretty obvious sort of thing. But while that policy was in place, while it was, law supported by the commander in chief, it was subverted by hundreds, if not thousands of military personnel and officers. So the point that, openly there's a pro-gay organization talking about and pro-transgender organizations putting the names, faces, commands of, multiple people who were in the military and openly queer and homosexual when those were supposed to be grounds for discharge. So what that means is their command was defying, insurrectionary behavior right here, defying the law and the policy of their country, of their commander-in-chief openly, and they received no reprimands for it. In fact, the Obama administration and Biden administrations promoted these sorts of officers, thereby accelerating and confirming their insurrectionary behavior and hatred towards the American Constitution.
The other part of that chapter is we hear often about the Army, well, all the branches essentially falling short of recruiting goals recently. And people say maybe they just don't want to serve anymore. Queer politics, though, is it playing a factor in perhaps encouraging young Americans not to serve their country?
Absolutely. The Wall Street Journal reported on some polls, I believe, last year that show that, because of the wokeness of the military, the prime demographic recruiting base of the military, which tends to be Southern white males, is their parents, even veterans, people, because in the United States, often the people who go into service tend to have someone in their family, father typically, or maybe an uncle who already was in service, right? So there's a family connection to military as well. And so the sorts of people who tend to familially recruit some of the best and most prolific recruiting areas for the military, majorities of them now are telling their loved ones, don't go into the military. It's too woke. It's too crazy. Especially, it's not just the sexual politics, although that's an aspect. There also the COVID vax that was used basically as a purge, of people, anyone who dissented from the regime. That's also a factor. There's our failure to win wars for pretty much since Vietnam, United States, all of these coming together. But I think the sexual politics thing, soldiers know that they're not there to put, men with all of their body parts right next to female recruits in their beds, as happened, as I talk about, that was in congressional record, a young lady who was a recruit was forced to sleep between two men with all their body parts, and that she's not the only one. So that's just nobody, wants to go into that environment if they're a patriot. And so the military is damaging its recruiting among its formerly most prolific sorts of people who would be inclined to serve their country in that way.
Joy Pullmann with us, her book, False Flag, Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. You write that the growth of divorce and unmarried childbearing in the U.S. is directly responsible for the psychological suffering contributing to the increasing number of Americans identifying as queer. So defend that. Why do you think you can make that connection between unmarried childbearing, divorce, and the psychological suffering?
Well, in fact, pro-homosexual researchers make that connection themselves. They point to studies, and I actually think that they're probably generally right on target, that show people who identify as LGBT have higher rates of all basically instances of psychological suffering, higher childhood trauma, higher anxiety, higher depression, higher suicide rates, all of those things. And as I write in the book, there's also Mary Eberstadt, a scholar at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, put a book out called Primal Screams, and in it she connects the sexual revolution's promotion of infidelity and therefore unwed childbearing with the identity politics affiliations of young people, because she notes that basically the sorts of things that young people who are taken into identity politics, ask for are basically, they want a sense of identity. And formerly families would give that sense of identity. You would know who you were because you talk like, dad. You have the nose of your grandpa. You have that sort of, pick a last name, Smith, the Smith walk, or, those are things that, hundreds and thousands of them over your lifetime being embedded in a culture and a people gives people a sense of identity to the point that they don't even have to talk about it. They know who they are. But when we have taken away all of these things from people, when we strip them from their families, and I'm not talking just nuclear, but also extended families, isolating people in as many ways as possible, people then start to wonder, she says, who am I? And they cannot answer that from their personal experience because they have so few relationship experiences. So then, politics provides an answer for them, especially as people hit puberty, right? That's a very strong urge, and people don't know what to do with that without any guidance from a traditional community, who passes on to children, young people, how to deal with such a big deal, such an awakening in their lives. And so, there's multitudes of different research, but it really does show very clear connections between increasing family isolation, abandonment, chaos, the lack of the stable home life for children, and increasing not only their support for identity politics, but their identification as something that gives them extra points on the intersectionality scale, somewhere that they feel like they can find the love and acceptance they should have gotten from their very own family.
Joy, the woke theocracy chapter, we just had an incident recently in Washington in which they painted a pride flag on the street, on the sidewalk, where cars drive, people walk, and a couple of, I'll call them kids, I don't recall their ages, but they were on scooters. They made some marks on the flag. They've now been arrested for
felonies,
right? For defacing the flag that was on the street. Why is this urge to defend that flag? Why is the connection that some even non-queer members of society feel to the flag, that pride flag, so strong?
Well, I think it's partly because it's actually difficult to express love for America nowadays. It's something that can earn you contempt, that can earn you jeers and criticism. So, people want to love something. They want to be affiliated with something. If you just look at sports affiliation, right? They want to wear their team's jerseys. That's just how people are. We want to be in tribes. We want to be connected, and we want to have a show that we are connected by the things that we wear and the things that we display. And so if you rip away people's natural connections, their family, their community, their country, their Christianity, their faith, their church, then they will still find something. And so the pride flag is something that, is safe to express, that shows that you're a good person, just like formerly maybe wearing a little cross necklace used to be, or something like that. And so it's that symbolism really is something that has underlying reality to it. And I think in my book, I pay very close attention to the lots of symbolism behind the pride movement and the things that it shares its affinities with. And it's kind of surprising sometimes where that will take you. And I'll make a quick aside here that I learned a lot about reading symbolism from my Hillsdale professors as an English major. And so this whole book, actually, I would say couldn't have been written without having gone to Hillsdale and learned what the Constitution means, what has been taken away from us. I rely on a lot of scholarship from Hillsdale professors, but that symbolism aspect, I think, is a little hidden one that also shows up there.
You also write in that chapter, pride strips away the crowning attributes that distinguish human beings from animals, language and reason. How does queer politics damage those two aspects, language and reason?
Well, the two are intimately tied, right? We have to use language to express our reason, to reason together. We even use that word reason together, right, to talk about conversing, right? So something Dr. Arnn actually points out all the time, I still listen to the Hillsdale online courses, is that humans are different from animals because of our capacity for speech. I think that's actually Aristotle, right? So, but that is something that sets human beings apart, that makes us different, and that gives us the capacity to govern ourselves if we are developed enough to elevate ourselves to that point. So sexual identity politics first eliminates our ability to reason and converse by, again, it destroys the family, and the family is where we learn the meaning of everything. You learn how to talk from family. You learn you're understanding the world, from your parents explaining it to you, from your grandma and grandpa, and all those people. That's where we get our language in our homes, in our family life. And children, so my primary area of specialty is education research, actually. And children develop, that language development is accelerated, by parents who read to them instead of parents who show screens to them, because conversation is just so rich in that meaning that young children need. And on that is the foundation for everything they do, right? If they don't have stable connections between symbol and meaning. So words, words are a symbol for the meanings that underlie them, right? The animal cat doesn't have to have the word cat attached to it. There's hundreds of words for cat in many languages, right? Mm-hmm. If we don't get that from our upgrowing, then we literally can't think well, right? Your ability to think is, I know this from education research, it's governed by the amount of vocabulary that you have. That's the first aspect there. By destroying families, absolutely sexual identity politics destroys our ability to reason, to be educated, self-governing people. And the second kind of area in which this is the case is by distorting language. So I'm doing a lot of media, related to the book. And I was just talking with another host about how, it's very hard for me even to write about the issue, because I deny the fact that, two men together can be a marriage, because, they cannot produce any children and their bodies don't fit together in the same way that a man and a woman fit together, right? So even the word marriage, to be used to apply to a different activity happening in the bedroom, or a different, connection, like lifelong sort of relationship people would have to each other, that eliminates our ability to reason and think to each other because we don't even mean the same thing by the same term anymore. And that happens all throughout pride ideology. I mean, I could go on and on there, but I think for the sake of time, we'll cut it short. But it is a constant thing with, we calling a man a woman is, one of the most rejections of reason and language that you possibly could have. And that's like a fundamental thing that the pride movement does. So in both of those ways, the pride movement erases language and reason and just turns us into emoting beings that are cared for by a caretaker government.
Final question for Joy Pullmann, her new book, False Flag, Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. If this is harming America, want to try to change it, you recommend a long game, incremental steps that slowly revive habits of self-government among the people. So what does that look like?
Well, it's a whole chapter, so in 30 seconds here, it's hard to reprise all of that. But I just like to talk about what individuals can do in their lives. My favorite policy proposal actually is introducing classic marriage law. So an option for people right now in every single state, you don't have a choice but to be in a no-fault marriage certificate situation. What if we just gave people the option to have the pre-no-fault divorce marriage certificate? They would still have the lane for the people who want an easy divorce, but for people who want there to be repercussions for someone who abandons the family, who commits an infidelity, that would help perhaps them stay faithful and protect the children, they could opt into that. That's my favorite one. But in individual lives, I really think that, the fact that we're even having this conversation and talking about this really proves that, Americans are super lonely. They're super isolated. Our families are really not in good shape. So anything that any one of us can do to help that, be a friend to a lonely person in our lives, to be a good mother or father, to be a mother or father at all in a world in which that's greatly discouraged, those are things that every single person can do that benefits our society, that we can do in our everyday lives, and that all of us could do better at and take some tiny steps towards it. So I think that's the most fundamental thing, is being people who have families and who make families as havens for the lonely people of the world, and that's somewhere that people can come to for refreshment and to find a sense of identity, so they don't have to find it in chaos and in politics.
Joy Pullmann is executive editor at The Federalist, a Hillsdale graduate and author of the new book, False Flag, Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. Joy, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Matthew Spalding from Hillsdale in D.C. and Joy Pullmann, a Hillsdale graduate. Her new book, False Flag, Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.